Welcome to GS Podcast number 91, brought to you by Audible. Audible's the place to go if you want an audio version of a book. They have, I think, over 200,000 books on there. Some classics, some non-fiction, new and old. And as a listener of this podcast, that entitles you to a free 30-day trial and a free audiobook that you can keep forever. Carry it around on your phone, on your Kindle if it plays audio, your non-brand specific MP3 player. And you can get this by visiting audibletrial.com/GS. I'm really happy and quite fortunate to have Terry McDermott on the GS podcast. I've been an admirer of Terry's work for quite a while, since he wrote an excellent book called Perfect Soldiers. It's about the 9/11 hijackers, explains their upbringing, documents their education, how they embarked on this plot, which has pretty much changed the way we look at things in terms of security, the way we look at things in terms of terrorism now. And it's an excellent objective piece of reporting. I think people may have noticed that I champion this book quite a bit and recommend it on social networks and on my podcast, and you may be forgiven for thinking maybe it's some anti-Islamic polemic, and it really isn't. What really struck me about the work is how much Terry just hones in on the facts, reports the details. He almost approaches it like a detective, and I find that really quite admirable in terms of journalism. It's something that I don't think we see enough of anymore. Maybe it's just my own cynicism at the way online journalism is. It's very agenda driven. Someone's always trying to sell you something, either ideologically or literally a product, to draw you in with either clickbait or smear pieces or hatchet jobs, things like that. So I can't recommend this book enough. Perfect Soldiers. I had a great chat with Terry on the show about it. Lots of little insights. This is a man who's not somebody who spends all these days surfing the internet and then came up with a book on it. He's travelled to over 20 countries, knocked on doors of the family and friends of these hijackers, and got a pretty exhaustive account of how this came to be. So I can't recommend it enough, like I've said. He's got another book out on Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who is considered the mastermind of the 9/11 plot, the man behind it, the planner. I think my Kindle's informed me I'm about 25% through that, and I'm equally gripped with that as I was with Perfect Soldiers. So what I would suggest is, if you've enjoyed hearing from Terry and you appreciate what he has to say on the podcast, say hello to him on Twitter, send him some love, some kind words at Terry McDermott. He has a website, tmcdermott.com. Definitely have a look on there, see what he's up to. You can keep up to date on this very podcast at gspellchecker.com. Enjoy.
There's a word that some folks find real hard to spell. Ain't it horrible for me, except after seeing who cared to go burn in hell? But then along came a man, a spiritual corrupt God of creed, and he set out upon a noble quest to help those that don't know what it means. And he said, go A-T-H-E-I-S-T, and don't you put that I before that E. A-T-H-E-I-S-T, don't mean we don't speak to W. And he keeps telling them things that God let's say. A reason sharp as a knife will make him run away. But if they start that fight, well, they can go all day. Spell checker, he's a guy with spell checker. Now you know how it goes, so sing along with me. A-T-H-E-I-S-T, 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 A-T-H-E-I-S-T.
It's a great pleasure to welcome Terry McDermott to the GS podcast. Welcome.
It's nice to be here. Thanks.
No problem. I was just saying to you off air, I'm a huge admirer of your work, and one of my favourite books, if you can have a favourite book on 9/11, is Perfect Soldiers. Such a really well written and objective account of how it happened and who was involved. I thought before we jump into the details on that, maybe you could tell my listeners a little bit about yourself and background, please.
Yeah, I've been a journalist for most of my adult life. Worked at newspapers for a long time, eight different ones, kept getting fired or quitting or something. I always seemed to want to do more than the newspapers wanted to do. And did some magazine work, and finally ended up at the Los Angeles Times, which is where I was when 9/11 occurred. And that's where the Perfect Soldier starts for me. I mean, I knew nothing about terrorism, radical Islam, anything prior to that.
Okay, so where were you on the day of the attacks? Do you remember that? Well, it's a silly question, of course you do.
Yeah, no, I was taking my middle daughter to her school carpool, and I had the radio on and heard on the radio what had happened, or what they thought had happened. At that point, nobody was quite sure, but there was a plane sticking out of the World Trade Center. So after I dropped her off, I still not knowing anything more, I went back to my house and actually packed a suitcase and went down to the office, Los Angeles Times office in downtown LA. By the time I got there, it was evident that it had been a terrorism attack of some sort, and the second plane had hit. And the immediate speculation was that it was Al-Qaeda. As I mentioned, I knew nothing about Al-Qaeda at that point. I mean, the guy who sat next to me worked on terrorism stuff, and he could actually never get his stuff into the newspaper. Nobody cared about it. And everybody kind of laughed at him for doing it. Of course, he was right and we were wrong. So that day, I'd volunteered to do anything that the newspaper wanted me to do regarding the attacks, and they didn't really have a plan yet. And so I just helped out on the sort of emergency coverage that occurred that day. And weirdly, I actually knew the people who had engineered the World Trade Center, the structural engineers on it, from some work I'd done previously that had nothing to do with terrorism or New York. And so I called them. It's a firm in Seattle where I used to live. And the guy I knew best there, the founder of the firm, had died, but his successor, the president, got on the phone. And I'm sitting in a newsroom in Los Angeles watching, CNN. He's sitting in a corporate office in Seattle watching CNN and talking to each other. And he said this, this really strange thing. He said, I know this sounds stupid and silly, but, the building worked. It caught the planes and it's still standing. And I mean, he no more said that than the first tower collapsed as we're both watching it. It was a very bizarre thing. And so anyhow, that was my introduction to 9/11. And I started working on that, and that's all I worked on for the next 4 years. First assignment I had was to do a profile on Mohammed Atta, who was considered then to be one of the planners of the attacks. He was the pilot of the lead airplane. And so, within a couple of weeks, I'd taken off for Cairo, which is where he was from, and began reporting on him. And basically spent the next several months doing that and wrote a story about him. It wasn't very long into the reporting that it became clear to me that he wasn't who we thought he was, that he wasn't this brilliant guy. He could not have possibly been a planner of the attacks. It just wasn't his personality whatsoever. But he was a very obedient, dutiful person. And so my profile of him pointed that out, that this guy was not some evil genius, not a genius, and probably not evil either, but a guy who thought actually that he was doing good, which was chilling to come to that conclusion. But I think it's almost universally the case with jihadists, is that they think they're doing God's work.
That's an interesting point about Mohammed Atta, about him not being this evil genius everyone thinks he is. And it's a theme that runs through your book quite a lot, really, that these individuals, these hijackers, these jihadis, were not necessarily exceptional people. They was actually quite ordinary in many ways, which is almost more concerning, isn't it?
Oh, completely so. In my reporting, I resisted that idea for a long time because it just didn't comport, right?
Yeah.
We think that people who do these horrible things have to be somehow exceptional, because if they're not, Well, we know there are fewer exceptional people in the world than there are ordinary people. And if ordinary people are capable of doing this stuff, that's scary because there's a lot of them.
It's a great point you make there about, it didn't really comport and you resisted it. And what really strikes me about your book is how objective it is, in the sense that it doesn't particularly lean on any one narrative. A lot of people would go into this project with maybe an anti-Islam focus, maybe an anti-foreign policy focus, maybe more of a political one. You seem to take an even view of all areas and report it quite objectively. I mean, was that a hard thing to do? I mean, having said that, you do put your own flourishes and your own insight in there, but it seems very matter of fact the way you structure this.
Well, I'm a reporter.
Sure.
Right? That's what I do. I'm a journalist. There are, at this point, I haven't looked lately, but there are well more than 10,000 books written about 9/11.
Wow.
What's unbelievable about it is that probably 99% of them are of the kind of book that you're speaking of. They're making an argument. There are polemics of one sort or another. They're trying to say who's to blame or whatever. That's not helpful to me. I think arguments are easy to make and just as easy to refute, and they're plentiful. And I think facts are scarce. Information, actual knowledge is scarce. And certainly about Al-Qaeda, about these attacks, we knew very little other than, we knew Bin Laden and we knew the airplanes hitting the buildings, and everything in between we didn't know. And so all I wanted to do was figure out how those guys got on the plane that day. I mean, where did these guys come from? What causes ordinary men to do stuff like this? That proved to be a lot harder than it sounds. I mean, it's so hard that of those more than 10,000 books, you know how many books are written about the hijackers?
How many?
One.
That's yours.
Yeah. I've written another 9/11 book about Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the man who planned the attacks. And there's 2 books about him. And isn't that remarkable, right?
That is very strange.
Yeah, well, it is until you think about it. The reason there aren't any more books on the hijackers is that it's too goddamn hard to do, because the facts are scarce. Think about it. If you're a journalist, and I am, and some crime has happened, this is really just a cops and robbers story to me. I mean, it's like doing a police report. There's a crime happened, so you want to profile the criminal. So who do you want to talk to when you're profiling a criminal? You talk to the people who knew him or her. And who knows him? Well, his family, his coworkers, in this case, fellow students. In all the stuff that had been written about Atta before I wrote anything, the only person who actually knew him who was quoted was his father, who was, to put it frankly, a little bit deranged by the whole thing. He was not really a useful witness in a lot of ways. He was just so distraught that he couldn't think clearly. And almost everybody else who was quoted speaking about as knowledgeable about Atta, one of the main sources was a professor in Germany, in Hamburg, Germany, where Atta had gone to graduate school, who was his graduate advisor but didn't know him at all. I mean, he maybe spent an hour with him in his whole time he was in Hamburg. So there was nobody. And absent all of these accounts were his other people in his family, were other students who knew him. I mean, he lived in Hamburg for 7 years and nobody knew him. I mean, it just didn't seem right. So all I tried to do all I did was knock on doors, literally and figuratively, trying to find people who knew him. And I'll tell you what, it's a very low yield business. You think about it, the people who talk, often people who talk are people who feel some remorse. People who knew him, knew the criminal, in this case a murderer, they knew the murderer. They talk because they somehow feel responsible. In this case, almost nobody seemed to have that motive. Nobody felt responsible in a way. And I think a lot of the people who knew him agreed with him about this. And, so what I've said often is that if you go looking for these people who knew him, first of all, you don't know who they are. Okay, so okay, once you find out who they are, you can't find them. Once you find them, they won't talk to you. Once they talk to you, they lie. So it's a slow going affair. It's trench warfare. There were literally weeks, where I lost more information than I gained. That being, you find out stuff that you thought was true was not.
Right.
So it was just really slow. But I'm a very stubborn person and obsessive. And I refused, probably just out of vanity more than anything else, I refused to not get the story. You know what I mean? I mean, that's how I always thought of myself. So I'm the guy who gets the guy, that I'll, track him down to the end of the earth. And I mean, I didn't go to the end of the earth, but I went to more than 20 countries doing this. So I'm not recommending this as a way to live. It's or as a way to stay sane. But I didn't really have a choice.
Yeah, well, I'm very grateful that you persevered on that. I mean, like you say, you visited 20 countries across, I think I read in your book, it's 4 continents. And it did make me wonder, actually, with you retracing the steps of some of these jihadists, did this flag up with any of our airport security at any point? Did anyone look at this and wonder what you yourself as an individual were up to? Did the security take an interest in your movements?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I'm sure that my phones were tapped for years. I met with lots of investigators around the world who were often as eager to talk to me as I was to them. Everybody was sort of fumbling around in the dark a little bit on this. So yeah, I mean, I did. I don't think anybody ever seriously thought I was a bad guy. I'm too white and Western to have fit in with that group.
Right.
But they never gave me any real problems. I mean, the problems I had were the ones that anybody would have, trying to get to places where you're not allowed to get to. I mean, trying to report in Saudi Arabia is a nightmare. You can't get a visa. Once you do, you can't get any cooperation. It's just horrible. So you're just sitting there in a hotel, spending money, not gathering information, because you can't go out by yourself. You can't do anything.
What were your safety concerns like in that respect? I mean, you're poking nests of places jihadists have frequented, some notorious jihadists no less. Did you ever feel threatened or unsafe?
Yeah, but really more in retrospect than at the time. I mean, I spent some time in the trunks of cars being transported places.
Wow.
I was, had my life verbally threatened several times. But I'm this sort of gallingly stupid American thinking that everybody likes me, right? And that it'll all be okay. So yeah, it was just naivete, I think, on my part. I did stuff that I shouldn't have done, a lot of it, and it was probably not worth it. Certainly, my family didn't think so when they eventually found out about it.
Wow.
But yeah, I mean, it's. Well, here's an example. In 2002, late 2002, 2003, I went to Pakistan for the first time, to Karachi. I was trying to track down information about Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the man who planned 9/11 attacks. And that's where he was headquartered. And I got there, I think, about 2 weeks after Daniel Pearl was murdered. And I talked with other reporters who were working on this for other publications, organizations, and we all kind of agreed that, well, we would never have done the stuff that Pearl did, that he really wasn't, he was more of a feature writer, and we were, hardened reporters. We knew better. And so I had all these rules of things. I said, well, I would never do the stuff he did. I would never meet people I didn't know, places I didn't know. I would never get in a car with somebody I didn't know. And so I go to Karachi and I spend 2 weeks there not getting anything, following all these rules, which basically means you can't do anything. So within, by the third week, I was breaking every rule I said I would never break. Purely because there was no other way to go about it. So you end up taking risks that you swore you would never. You were too smart to take. Well, you were too stupid to know you were going to take them, I guess, is what it amounts to. So, it's not smart, but it had a useful outcome.
One of the things that really strikes me in your book is the way you document the intelligence services, and I suppose the hindsight bias plays a lot into this, but they seem remarkably unprepared for this type of threat because it was unprecedented, seemed completely off the radar, and I think Hollywood can give us an overinflated expectation of what our security services are capable of as well. How did you view this information when you was uncovering it, just how unequipped our intelligence services were to deal with this type of threat?
But my basic view of human beings is that they're incompetent.
Yes.
One of the reasons I've never been an adherent of conspiracy theories is because I think it implies too much competence, that people aren't able to coordinate, they aren't able to keep quiet, they aren't able to, make nefarious plans and have no one find out about it. They're much more apt to screw shit up, and they do it all the time. And so I wasn't terribly surprised. I mean, I had never really thought about it much. I'll tell you what did surprise me about this. If you spend any time in the Middle East in those years, it was so common to have people have Middle Easterners, have Arabs, have Muslims, have everybody say that one of the reasons they thought that it had to be a conspiracy theory was because they thought that they themselves that the Arabs were too incompetent to do this, and they had this view of the CIA and the Mossad as these gods in the sky who could do anything. And so it was, they had the same idea that the truthers had here in the United States, that it couldn't have been them who did it. It had to be the CIA. It had to be somebody, because the thing. One of the reasons for that is that we make the feat out to be bigger than it is. It's not that brilliant a plan. It's clever, but all it took were guys willing to die. I mean, it was as I say, clever. I mean, it's basically KSM, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, had the same plan back in 1995. Where he was going to hijack airplanes and put bombs on them, and then get off the plane, he and a bunch of other guys, and they would blow up later. But it's the same plane, same plan. It's just he substituted the pilots for the bombs and turned the planes into the weapons. I mean, it's a horribly nefarious plan, but it's not a work of genius. Filling a truck full of explosives and ramming it into an embassy is not brilliant either, right? These guys, Al-Qaeda, the mistake we made and continue to make, actually, I think, is we overestimate their prowess. They're not. Al-Qaeda's secret was that not that it was a huge organization, but that it was such a small organization. That it was so small you couldn't see it almost. It didn't take much. I used to find it astonishing that everybody I talked to or read about who was somehow involved in this, they'd all met Bin Laden or Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. And I thought, geez, what an organization. Even the smallest guy gets to meet the top guy. How many people in the United States have met the president? Not very many. But then I realized, well, it's because there weren't very many of them. The organization was tiny. Of course he would meet everybody. There just weren't that many people in it. Yeah,
it's funny you should say that. I think I seem to remember a news broadcast a while back showing an Al-Qaeda propaganda video, and there was someone speaking in the foreground, and in the background was supposed to show this huge army training, and I think what you notice after about 2 minutes of footage is it was the same people sneaking behind the camera and going by the camera again to sort of give an inflated number of the threat there. So I mean, you touched a little bit there on truthers, and I have to say I have a particular pet hate for conspiracy theories, especially 9/11 conspiracy theories. And you must be somebody who has been confronted by various people who are probably even angry at you for putting your book forward. What have them experiences been like?
Well, it's subsided finally, but I couldn't go out of the house for
Really?
a couple of years without being confronted by these people. Just every time I made a public appearance, they'd show up. It's just, man, I felt for them because, I think they're delusional to a certain extent, and they're operating from this premise I just talked about, that the government is super powerful. Man, if you've spent your career, writing stories about government, different governments, as I have, nothing could be farther from the truth. I mean, they just mess stuff up all the time. So I just found it's sad in a lot of respects. And it's just unnecessary. I mean, I've always been sort of an Occam's razor guy. You take the simplest solution that fits the facts.
Yeah.
There's the famous saying. If you hear hoofbeats in the distance, it's probably horses, not zebras, right? and I think that the conspiracy theory guys, the truthers, are looking for zebras, and I'm not. If I find a horse, then I'm pretty happy if that horse looks like it fits the facts. And as at the beginning of the conversation, you point out that I didn't seem to be making an argument, and I wasn't. I was just trying to fit the facts. I was trying to get as many facts as I could in one place, and assemble them into some coherence. And the simplest explanation for it was the one that became the book, the two books. And it's that these relatively ordinary guys did this. And it wasn't too difficult to do. That's not exciting. I think in the end, our overestimation of the enemy here led us into Iraq. It led us into this decade and a half now of horror in foreign policy, and largely because we couldn't conceive. By we, I mean the American government, couldn't conceive that this wasn't some state that did this. I mean, all of our systems are built to confront other state entities, and so we couldn't see clear enough that it wasn't state entities that was responsible for this. There's a famous scene in Richard Clarke, who was the Deputy National Security Advisor on 9/11. That night, after a meeting among the cabinet and including Clarke about what the response should be, what to do, after the meeting was over, Rumsfeld pulls Clarke aside and says, because at the meeting they had talked about it's Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and Rumsfeld says, I want you to look at Iraq too. And Clarke says, well, why on earth would I do that? That's, Al-Qaeda's not in Iraq. It's in Afghanistan. Rumsfeld says, I know that. He says, but there aren't enough targets in Afghanistan.
Wow.
It's just too small. Al-Qaeda's too small. So we needed something. Our imagination required a bigger enemy. So we manufactured one.
Yeah, I mean, I think as well with you saying that these very few books written about the actual hijackers, very little popular knowledge then in that case in regards to their background, and I think that helps feed into this narrative that they weren't particularly bright or they came from very underprivileged backgrounds, and reading through your book and hearing about their education and their opportunities and their home life, they're largely well-educated middle-class men, really, aren't they? Yeah,
largely middle class. They're the people I know best among the hijackers, the ones I was able to find the most information on, are the guys who had spent time in Germany. And they were all, middle class. I mean, Ada's father is a lawyer. Ziad Jarrah's family were commercial property owners and bureaucrats. Marwan al-Shehi's father was a prayer caller. Hani Hanjour's father, he's the pilot of the plane that hit the Pentagon. Hani's father is a businessman. That's the Saudi guys were largely from middle class families in the southwestern part of Saudi Arabia. They weren't underprivileged. That's not what this is about. The guys in Germany, Ada al-Shehi Jarrah, were part of a group that gathered at one particular mosque, basically the only mosque in Hamburg, which is where they were. It just so happens to be one of the most radical mosques in Europe. They didn't know that when they went there. They went there because they're these desert boys and they're in cold, wet Hamburg.
Right.
And they were looking for some part of home. And they just end up being enraptured by the movement. They spent literally years trying to decide what they should do. What was the right thing to do for them as good Muslims? What was the proper thing for a young man who feels the world spinning out of control? What should he do? And they eventually decided that they should go fight. And they decided they would go fight the Russians in Chechnya. I mean, they didn't set out to attack the United States. They wanted to fight the Russians on behalf of their fellow Muslims who were being slaughtered. But they were told they couldn't go to you just couldn't show up in Chechnya, you get killed. So what you have to do is go to Afghanistan and get trained, and then they'll send you. So then they head off for Afghanistan, and they show up almost, I mean, the coincidence here is frightening. Within a week or two of when Bin Laden had blessed the plan, and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was looking for pilots. He was looking for people from the West who could travel in the West and who were technically capable enough that they could learn to fly airplanes. And these guys just show up. I mean, he must have just, nearly fainted in joy. After the first maybe 6 months of reporting, I spent a year trying to figure out who had recruited these guys. And the thing is, they weren't recruited. They're all volunteers. I thought there had to be some huge system of recruiting because we thought it was just a big entity. It's not. These guys just show up. I mean, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed said at one point that they were oversubscribed for martyrs.
Wow.
That more people were willing to die than they had plots to put them in.
One thing that I find is exempt from this conversation quite often that your book documents quite well is the ideological component derived from Islam, which is not to say that it is the true version of Islam, but it certainly is a version, or the worst possible version. And it's really quite striking just how important this version of Islam they had, how important this was in their lives. And it's something that mainstream people, even elected officials, especially in your country, are very reluctant to acknowledge. Does that frustrate you at all?
Oh, sure. I liken radical Islam to what we think of, what we in the United States are more familiar with. They're Protestant cults, Christian cults. I mean, I think Al Qaeda, ISIS, they're cults. They're large cults, but they're cults. They're perversions of what the religions that they say that they're honoring. But most of these guys are religiously motivated. They're not doing it out of because they hate. I mean, what the Bush administration, they hate our freedoms, they hate whatever. There were things written that Otta hated skyscrapers. I mean, it's just utter bullshit. They're religious men, and they were doing what they thought God wanted them to do. I'm not a believer of any sort, and I've often wished that I was. I wish that I was able to believe, but boy, seeing this stuff turns you into a non-believer pretty fast if you weren't. When I was a kid, a young adult, I mean, I admired Mao. I thought, he's right. You can't reform a country. In my case, the United States, and his China. You just have to take it down to the ground, right? And then start over. And then early in my reporting career, I was fortunate or unfortunate enough to go to Cambodia. And this is in the late 80s when there were no reporters in Cambodia. And to see the devastation that kind of belief caused to a whole society just shook me to the bones. I mean, I just felt, man, this is what happens. I mean, this is if you want to go back to year zero, as the Khmer Rouge said, this is what you do. You kill everybody. You kill them because they wear eyeglasses. I mean, it's just, I interviewed a guy there who was a cabinet minister of social services, and I asked him how he got in the job, and he said, "Well, I was the only one here." And I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "Well, I was the only one left alive." Literally the only one. So, that's what belief wrongly wielded and belief that won't yield to knowledge, it can take you to some really horrible places. And it isn't just within Islam. That said, this one is. Okay, this is a cult within Islam. And I think the more difficult part of this is once you've come to that conclusion is what do you do about it? And I don't think there's really much we can do at all in the West. I think this has to be solved within Islam. Everything we do seems to make it worse. I'm damn sure that dropping bombs on people in the middle of Yemen isn't going to solve this.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I've spoke to a few Muslim reformers, people who are trying to engender this liberal interpretation of Islam, and there's two issues with that for me really. Is that I think it's really difficult to find a liberal plausible interpretation, but I'm happy that they're trying and I support them. And secondly as well, they don't seem to get a great amount of support from various Muslim communities or Muslim organisations. They're almost outcast as traitors, and they're called horrible things like Uncle Toms, native informers, even agents of Mossad, which is, the theme of anti-Semitism within Islam is well documented in your book as well. I mean, do you think this lack of an idea, a way of dealing with this problem is what's maybe empowering somebody like Trump at the moment? Yeah,
I think it's fear to a significant degree. Not just being outcast, but being, murdered.
Yeah.
There's it's, first of all, Islam is just by its nature is conservative.
Yes.
Right. And the predominant interpretation of Islam, all of them, even the ones that are at war with one another, all cling to the actual truth of the Quran, the literal truth, that and taking things back to the way it was in the days of the Prophet. I mean, that's a very reactionary place to start from. And change is seen as bad. I mean, change is the modern world, which they're trying to get away from. It's a version of the modern world. I mean, Middle Eastern culture has its own version of the modern world, different than the one we have in the West. But they look at us and they see, godless hedonism. They don't see that as a way to go. I would, I would surely look at Donald Trump as a prime example of that. This is what you get. I mean, this is the logical outcome of American culture is Donald Trump. It's a really tough problem. I mean, I don't pretend to know how to solve it. It'll be solved at some point or be minimized. But I think it's going to have to happen within Islam, not from outside.
You released your book. Was it 2005? Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, and the KSM book came out in 2012.
Okay, so I mean, since Perfect Soldiers, we've had Bin Laden hunted down, and he's been killed by American Special Forces. Were you surprised at all to find out he was holed up in Pakistan quite comfortably?
No, not at all. I mean, almost every significant Al-Qaeda person who's been captured was in Pakistan. There's a really good book by a guy who teaches at, I think, London College, called Pakistan, A Hard Country. And it's a difficult place. And we forget here, or never knew here, that that it was founded as an Islamic state. And yet there's been a war going on within Pakistan almost since its founding over what Islam is or how to live it. There's been a sectarian war between Sunnis and Shias going on there since at least the early 80s, with the Gulf states funding the Sunnis and Iran funding the Shias. It's resulted in tens of thousands of deaths. I mean, there are way more Muslims killed by Muslim terrorists than there are Westerners killed by them.
Yeah.
That country is tearing itself apart. And we talk about how difficult reform is. I mean, geez, they didn't even talk about reform. They're just talking about allowing two interpretations of the same religion to coexist. Pakistan. So yeah, Pakistan is not a unipolar authority. There is not one. I mean, power is divided significantly within the country. The president has some, the army has some, the intelligence services have some, the wealthy class has some, and within those there are further divisions. But it's been true from the beginning that, especially within the intelligence services, that there's been a strong support for radical Islam, radical Sunni Islam, and they've aided the Taliban, they aided Al Qaeda. So to have Bin Laden finally show up in Pakistan is not. I would have been surprised if he was somewhere else.
Right. I mean, so you wrote extensively about the hijackers. You wrote about Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, and I suppose a logical pattern would mean maybe something on Bin Laden. Is there any appetite for a book on that?
I think it's been well satisfied. There's a lot of books on Bin Laden. Some of them really good. I couldn't contribute to that. It's not. That's this. I did these books because they weren't being done. And they were subjects that were a better fit for my skill set. And that, as I mentioned before, is this sort of obsessive drudgery of knocking on doors, of just going places and trying to find people. To elaborate a little bit on why there haven't been other books, it's extraordinarily expensive. You couldn't do it on your own. I mean, the first several years when I was doing the reporting, I was working for the Los Angeles Times, and they paid for everything. I mean, I never added it up, but it has to be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe more,
right.
that I spent. Well, who's going to do that? What journalist can afford to do that on his own? Nobody. If you propose to a magazine to go do a piece on some aspect of terrorism, they're going to want a budget. The budget's going to be, well, you can spend whatever, $4,000 and you travel for 3 weeks. And it's like, are you kidding me? 3 weeks? You might not find the bathroom in 3 weeks. You're sure not going to track down a bunch of people and persuade them to talk to you. It just doesn't work that way. I mean, this is not where you go, you call and you make an appointment to see the Secretary of State or the member of Parliament. It doesn't work that way. You actually go in the streets and try to find people, and that's slow.
Yeah.
So, and as I said, it just costs enormous money. When I did travel on my own, after I was at the paper or when I was on leave from the paper, I'll tell you what, I slept on a lot more couches than I did nice hotel beds.
Well, I mean, you were one of the first people to really. I mean, you jumped on this really quick after the atrocities of 9/11, and you were sort of on the front lines, really trying to dig up new information. And you got the book out really quick, like I say, 2005, and we've had quite a bit of time since it was released. Now, is there anything that's come up since that you wish you would have had known that you could have included? Is there anything there that you may have found not completely accurate? What are your thoughts on the book looking back?
Well, when I set out to do the book, this is after I'd done several long newspaper pieces. What I wanted from the book was, there's a kind of book that's sort of the stand-in for a period of time before a real book comes along. I mean, the book that gathers what's known at the moment and tries to make sense of it. And then at some point, somebody will come along, or maybe several somebodies, and do definitive works on it. I'm pretty sure now there's not going to be another book. It's just the information isn't there. I don't know how you would gather it now. It'd be really hard to do. So, for better or worse, I think, especially with Perfect Soldiers, that's it, folks. We're not going to learn any more about these guys, I don't think. That said, there are a couple of mistakes in the book, having mainly to do with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. A couple of scenes that I've found out since did not occur. things that people told me, and more than one person, several people had told me, just turned out not to be true. But none of the main things. When you write, after I wrote the first profile of Ada, the next piece I did was on an overall view of the plot. It took a full year to put together, with a lot of help from other reporters. And at the end of that, I wrote it, and at the top of it, I wrote this thing saying that this is the best knowledge we have right now about how this all happened. But it's really not. It's a theory. It might be wrong. And my editor just went crazy. He says, "Shit me!" He says, "This thing ran in 8 pages of the Sunday paper. I mean, 8 full pages of a paper that circulated at that time more than 1 million homes. So you're talking about 8 million pages of newsprint." He says, "I am not going to spend that kind of money, that kind of newsprint on a theory." He says, "Get that out of there." We're not but it was kind of a theory. And when you publish something like that, even if you've tried to acknowledge it, I mean, you're scared to death that you screwed something big up, right? That there's something, somehow you misconstrued this. People make mistakes. As I said, I'm a human being also. I'm not grossly competent, but I'm careful, or try to be. So I was, lived in fear that it would be wrong, and it pretty much not. Most of the stuff that is in both books and most of the articles, the overwhelming majority of it is completely right. I think it's proven to be correct. I'm not sure if in any of the writing I've done that I fully conveyed the notion that of what a small organization Al Qaeda is, and the notion that radical Islam does not pose an existential threat to the West. It just does not. It cannot. We have a greater capacity to harm ourselves than they have to harm us. I mean, they can kill people almost at will, but that's a crime, really. I mean, almost anybody can kill almost anybody else, especially if they don't know them, and get away with it. Because random killings are hard to stop. Or not hard; they're impossible to stop in a free society, or in almost any society. It's just hard to stop that. There's no such thing as perfect security, and I think that we've not done a good job of understanding what we're up against here, and we've overinflated the threat. I thought, after the first year or so of reporting, that we would have, a shopping mall bomb every other week, or something like that, or a water supply poisoned, or a power station shut down. I was really kind of stunned that hadn't happened, and I don't think it was prevented from happening by us. Not to a great extent. But anyway, now we're actually closer to that now. I mean, we've had so many terrorism attacks around the world in the last 12 months that it seems more likely now than it did then.
Yeah, I think as well, I mean, demographics could play a part in this, because I think Europe in general paints a different picture. We tend to be foiling attacks almost daily at the moment, and I think America, for the size of it, I think has a relatively low Muslim population compared to, say, Europe does. And I hope you're right about it not being an existential threat, and it's something that isn't as concerning as most people make it out to be. But do you feel that in terms of trends of population, the increase of numbers may prove that wrong? Well,
I don't think it will ever be an existential threat. Is it a security concern? Absolutely. And yeah, as demographic trends continue, you'll have a larger vulnerable population, vulnerable in the sense of people who will get caught up in this, who will volunteer, get recruited, take part in it. There's a real sense of loss in the world, I think, that people feel that they've lost control of their lives, of their countries, their families, whatever. The things aren't what they once were. I'm not sure how valid that concern is. I mean, there's change occurs all the time. So, of course, things are different now. But whether it's right or not to perceive things that way, people do, and it drives them to action. So I think the understanding now that the sort of lone wolf terrorist can succeed as more people who have potential to become those wolves learn about this, then the possibility of that happening, the probability of it happening more increases. And certainly for a single guy or a couple guys, it's almost impossible to stop somebody until they've done it. I mean, you don't even know about them until they've done it. It's not a crime to think these things; it's a crime to do them.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting looking back now on how those 19 hijackers managed to communicate and plan things, and the internet wasn't quite the thing it is today. And I think that, I mean, what's your feeling on the role the internet's playing in terms of jihadist recruitment now, and the ability to communicate rapidly and spread this version of Islam?
Yeah, Bill Clinton, when he was president, he used to call modern technology is sort of the dark underside of globalization, that we didn't know its power. And basically you're basically talking about modern communications, and the ability to join with someone on the other side of the earth, to make common cause with them. And yeah, it certainly provides a lift to anybody who wants to do this stuff. It makes it easier. It doesn't mean that they couldn't do it otherwise, but it makes it way easier. On the other hand, as we learn more, electronic communications are also the most susceptible to intercept by intelligence agencies. Yeah. I mean, I think almost everybody who was captured, a significant Al-Qaeda guy who was captured, were captured because of phone calls or some sort of electronic communication had given them away. So it works both ways, I guess.
I suppose I could tie the internet in a little bit and ask you about journalism. Journalism's something I'm really interested in. I'm trying to study it a bit myself, and you gave a perfect answer to my question at the beginning when I said, how did you stay so objective? And you just said, well, you're a reporter. And I think that's great, and that's exactly the answer I'd want. But I suppose I have a little bit of cynicism towards journalism, in no small effect by the internet, in terms of people right now a lot for advertising, for they have to go with sensationalism to get clicked. It seems like a more of a cutthroat enterprise than it's been before. More people are able to participate in it as a profession. How do you see what kind of effect the internet's had on journalism?
Well, it's in a way, in a significant way, it's a lot like journalism was before mass media existed, when people were publishing pamphlets in their basement. Right. There were not big media companies, and there wasn't the kind of journalism we have now either, because you weren't able to do it. I mean, the internet, a podcaster, for example, is not going to get on a plane tonight and fly to southern Philippines to do a podcast on radical Islam in Mindanao, right?
Right, sure.
You can't do it. So I think that to a significant extent that journalism is returning to that sort of solo practitioner mode, and yeah, the way Western journalism was done, basically in the latter half of the 20th century up until the last few years, it was done in sort of how it should be done was codified. This notion that you needed to be objective, that the reporter wasn't part of it, that you did your best to keep your own views out of it. That for one, I mean, that's literally impossible. But if you're raised in that ethos, then you tried your damnedest to do it and to check yourself, to make sure that you weren't doing this because of what you thought or what you didn't. You can't leave your house without some theory, right? You have to have an idea of where you're going, or you don't even know where to go.
Yeah.
So you have some frame. You always have some frame. You have to. You have to be aware of what it is, and it has to be rebuttable. I mean, I think you pose an hypothesis on why this happened, but the hypothesis confronts facts, and if the facts overturn it, then they overturn it. You can't get married to your idea. Then you're committing the same sin that the terrorists are committing. They're committed to their idea. So you have to acknowledge that, one, they have that. Two, it's way easier to, in this new age of journalism, we've gone back to sort of argumentation. There's much more polemicism, much more personal view, and theoretically, out of all of that noise, emerges a signal. I'm not so sure, and I'm not so sure that it sure doesn't happen quickly. I think the Trump campaign here in America has caused a lot of journalism organizations to examine where they stand and to how they do business. This on the one hand, on the other hand, kind of objectivity down the middle of the road. Maybe that doesn't work so well. If the people you're reporting on are willing to do whatever, that you have to change the way you go about your business as a journalist. I still think, that the facts are really precious things. That reporting serves a civic function in all societies, and I'm much more interested in a factual account than I am in somebody's idea of what happened. How that's going to work out in the future, I have no idea, because these big organizations, many of them have failed. I mean, the Los Angeles Times, when I got my first assignment on ADA, the exact words the editor gave to me were, go wherever you need to go, stay as long as you need to stay.
Right.
I mean, can you imagine that?
No.
Yeah. And that just would not happen now. And it wouldn't have happened almost anywhere then even. It was extraordinary. But I think what we will lose in the transition to whatever kind of media we're going to end up having is the ambition to do big things. Here in the United States, there's really only one newspaper that will do that kind of stuff now, the New York Times. The LA Times can't afford to do it anymore. The Washington Post can't afford to do it anymore. Well, the Post has done a really good job in this election cycle covering politics, but you just don't have the numbers of people. The LA Times has about a third as many editorial staff people as they did when I was there. I was there for 2 years, and I'd see people's names in the paper whom I'd never seen before. I said, well, is this somebody new? He says, oh, no, he's here. He just hasn't published anything for a couple of years. It's the opposite of the way things are now, where, every story has to get enough clicks or you're not going to be doing any more of those kinds of stories. So I think the civic functions are in danger of being lost.
I'm hoping that there'll be a bit of fatigue at that kind of reporting at some point, and people will start returning to the factual-based, objective reporting, the kind of thing that I'm very pleased that you think is important. But I mean, I've pretty much asked you everything I was going to ask, and I'm really grateful for you for coming on and speaking to me about this. Is there anything at all you'd like to touch on or get across before I let you get back to your morning?
No, just to expand a little bit on that last point, it's not because people don't want to do this kind of stuff. It's because they don't have the money to do it anymore.
Right.
And for whatever reason, news organizations have lost enormous amounts of advertising. And whether the advertising ever worked for the advertisers, I have no idea. But it's now the media universe is so subdivided that just as there are not aggregates of, I mean, the LA Times has more readers today than it ever had, but it has a third as many reporters because it has a third as much revenue, or maybe less than that. I don't know what the numbers are. But the revenue is the big thing. They've lost just tons of revenue. And it's not just newspapers, but all forms of news media have, television, whatever. It's just there isn't enough money to do the kind of stuff they used to do. They were monopolies before. They could do whatever they wanted. They had just like an endless stream of money. It just depended on their willingness to do it. Well, now they've got the willingness, but not the money. I don't see that changing, sadly.
That is a very depressing note to end on, I suppose. I mean, I suppose in a way that a lot of people are, like you say, going back to that solo model, aren't they? These are sort of a crowdsourced aspect to journalism that perhaps didn't exist before, where people can build a readership and they can fund them to go out and investigate and do things. Is that a model you're familiar with, or something you'd consider yourself?
Well, I'm familiar with it. I just don't, I don't think you can raise enough money doing it that way.
Yeah.
I mean, you can do stuff. I mean, I did a story a long time ago. I can remember on a website here in the United States called Talking Points Memos. Basically started by one guy who started writing about politics, and now it's got I don't know what their readership is, but it's high, and he's got a staff of like 15 or 20 people, and that's how they've done it. Basically, is on donations.
Right.
So it's possible. But, could that guy, his name is Josh Marshall's his name. Josh could not afford to send a reporter out for a year to report on Muhammad Atta.
Yeah.
No way in hell. I mean, he just couldn't do it. It'd bankrupt the organization. And there aren't many organizations that have that kind of money now. That's the problem. So you can do certain things, but you're just going to do less of it. You have to be more careful with your resources. And then the question becomes how willing are you to do things that people might not be that interested in, but you think are important?
Right. Yes.
That becomes a bigger question.
Yeah. So things that are perhaps less commercial in that respect. Well, Terry, I want to say a big thanks again for coming on the podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you.
You're welcome. Yeah. Thanks for having me on. Good luck to you.
Thank you very much to my excellent guest, Terry McDermott. What a pleasure. And thank you very much for listening. You can keep up to date on this podcast at gspellchecker.com. Think we've all learned something here today?